The label witch is something that has been created to be a label of fear and a label of oppression. Hence, with the reclaiming tradition, why it's so important to be a witch, because it's like saying, this is me, this is what I'm defining to be a witch.
My name is Marigold Santos. I'm a visual artist based out of Montreal, Quebec, and Calgary, Alberta. I'm a Philippine ex-Canadian woman, and I am also a Libra middle child.
And this is what you feel sums you up as a person, a Libra middle child?
Yeah, you know what? It does, actually. I feel like being a Libra has been something that's been coming up a lot recently, and it gives me joy, so I'm okay with saying that.
So how did you get into astrology? Is that something that's like one of your main forays into witchiness?
You know what? It could be definitely an entry point into the witchiness of things. I think that astrology carries a lot of magic around it, and there's a lot of potential. And to me, I feel like magic is really all about potential and the ability to choose, one way or another. And I think there's a lot of power in that. So if I had to say, power and magic are very intertwined, and choice is really up there as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that your art also deals with the vulnerability, the power of vulnerability as well. Like there's something in your artist statement, and I'm probably going to misquote it, but I think you said like, you love precariousness.
Yes.
Now that's something that most people would try to avoid, would be precariousness. So can you get into that?
Yeah. When I talk about precariousness, I talk about precariousness and identity, because I think oftentimes we really try to, and I do it myself too, sum ourselves up. And actually the ambiguity of everything is really a special thing, where you don't really have to, get caught up in a binary and be one way or another. And actually the spectrum in between is really where all the specialness sort of sits. And so precariousness to me is really this idea about teetering and not very, or like this instability, and embracing that flexibility. And a lot of that too can be tied into my work, where I really celebrate multifariousness and fragmentation and hybridity, and all of those things can contribute to this idea of precariousness and identity.
And do you think that, it seems obvious, but I'm going to ask the question anyway, is that related to your family being a family of immigrants?
Yeah, my immigrant background is a really big part of my art and a really big part of my identity. My family had immigrated to Canada from the Philippines in 1988. So I was a young girl. I was 7 when we moved to Canada, or I turned 7 rather. And for me at the time, my main concern as a child was just to integrate as best as I could into Canadian culture. And that meant learning how to speak English and learning how to dress like a Canadian kid and understanding this different geography and weather and social landscape that I was not used to. And being a child, your experience of the world is quite limited still, but it's also a very raw and pure way of really experiencing things as well. And so, yeah, it just, it's deeply rooted to that time where I kind of made these choices that to sort of adapt and become resilient. And I didn't even really know it until way after the fact, and as an adult reflecting back onto that time in my life and why it features so prominently in my artwork.
That was going to be my next question, is that how do those feelings manifest in physical form? Yeah,
so reflecting on that time where it was such a pivotal moment where I stopped speaking my mother tongue and adopted English. And to this day, I don't speak Tagalog anymore, but my parents speak to me in Tagalog, and I understand it fluently, but I just don't speak it, and I respond back in English. And I think I really think about those moments about being a person that is affected by the multiple homes and the multiple senses of self that you can develop when you're a person of diaspora. And so my work now really deals with this idea of identity and selfhood that is very fragmented, that is very multiple, but that the power in multiplicity is the essence of the work. And again, I talk about like the power of choice and the power of multiplicity and gaining strength in those notions, and that's really where the magic lies.
You said magic. Can you define magic? Your definition, obviously. We gather perspectives one at a time here, so.
Yeah. For me, magic is a lot of things. It's really not one thing. Magic is potential. Magic is the idea to incite change through choice. And the results of that is also magic in some ways. Magic is imagination and creativity. And I think magic is the unknown. So it's all those things and more.
Mm-hmm. And your art deals with sort of like permanence and impermanence. You're speaking about diaspora. So how did you get into tattooing, which is the most permanent, I think, art form? How did you transition from being a painter sculptor into a tattooer?
Yeah, I mean, for me, my work already at heart of it is it's quite interdisciplinary. So I will cycle through painting and drawing and sculpture and installation work, some performance work, animation, sound, all sorts of things. And tattooing was just a natural progression to go there. So I don't ever consider myself a tattoo artist. I just am still a visual artist that also tattoos. So it's just another way for me to be making marks. And for me, what I found was that in my studio, most people will know my work as very big paintings, really large scale.
And we'll post a bunch of visuals on the Instagram and in the show notes for this episode, so you can see with your eyes what we're talking about here. Go on.
Yeah, and so and that's a very intimate thing that I have with my work itself. It's very private. I'm in the studio, and not a lot of people see my process, and I kind of keep it that way. But tattooing is this other thing where I have a very intimate moment with somebody else, and it's a very private, intimate moment between me and a person where we have a agreement and kind of like a sacred space together where we are sharing a moment. And that is specifically, they've asked me to permanently place one of my images onto their body that they then live with for the rest of their lives. And so
this is an honor that someone is giving you.
And it's an honor for me, and it's an honor for each other. Oftentimes after tattooing, I say to them, I really give a big thanks, and I say, like, this tattoo is going to follow you for the rest of your life, and it will follow you to every country you visit, and it will see every lover you have until the day you die. And so thank you for having me be part of your life, basically. So it's quite important to me, and it's quite special. And I wanted to also include that in my art practice because, like I said, painting, drawing in the studio is a really private time for me, and so it was. It just opened up my practice to have other individuals in there.
And you said you kind of prefer that nobody sees your process, but can you describe it to us, or is even the description too private?
No, the process of making work in the studio, or a process. Yeah. Oh yeah, it's. I guess it's private only because, to me, like, my space of a creative agency, which is my studio, is just a really special space. And so it has my energy in there. And my energy sometimes is, tired and lazy and procrastinating. And other times it's really hyper-focused. And I give the credence to that. So if I want to come into my studio and spend 3 hours mucking about, then I will, and it's sort of like a warm up, and I don't think people really need to see that. But then other times when I'm in the flow, I'm really in the flow, and I don't need to, I would prefer not to be interrupted, so that I just allow that process to sort of flow out of me, and then I can go for a long time. So,
do you do any performance art where that process is visible?
I have done some performances that I can think of off the top of my head. One, when I was doing my master's at Concordia, I did, because I'm also a musician, I did this performance where I drew on my skin. I drew a whole bunch of these eyeballs and these marks, and then I picked up my guitar and I sang a song about these ghost children, which were versions of myself as a woman, immigrant, and sort of having myself be fragmented. And I sang this song, and it was a loop, and it looped and looped for 25 minutes. I also did another performance where I made a whole bunch of black fingers out of wax, and they were cast of my fingers, middle fingers, a lot, and thumbs, and they were individual, and I stuck them on the gallery walls, and then I lit them one by one. And then as they were all lit, the wax would drip down the white walls, and the wax was black because they were coming from these fingers. And then afterwards, I blew them out, and they extinguished them. And then the remnants of those black wax finger candles just drip down the gallery walls for the rest of the exhibition.
They've remained in the gallery in that space. So there were people there who saw how the drips happened, and then there were other people who showed up later and just saw the result.
Yeah, and they could just surmise what had happened.
Mm-hmm. Super magical.
Yeah, that exhibition was one in Calgary at Stride Gallery, and Stride Gallery has almost like two rooms that join up to be one. And so when I had that exhibition, I really wanted to have two distinct exhibitions, so two distinct bodies of work, but that had a relationship with each other and had a conversation, because clearly it's my work. So the first side was called Coven Ring. And that
Ding. We heard the C word.
Coven Ring. And Coven Ring really had to do with the work that I had made that drew parallels between witchcraft and boxing.
Boxing, like fighting.
Yeah, and it's a kind of a strange thing because, at first glance, you can't really tell what those parallels might be. But at the time of my work, I was starting to really research a lot more about witchcraft, and I can tell you a little bit about later why when we talk about Filipino folklore. But to go back, I started just researching witchcraft in general. Yeah, there's actually, the more that we talk, Amy, there's a lot more that I can really tell you about and share. But yes, so I was researching witchcraft, but at this exact same time, I had taken up boxing as a recreational sport for myself, just completely unrelated. But as I was getting very serious about boxing, I was also starting to research that because naturally that's what you do when you're an artist. And I found this essay called On Boxing by Joyce Carol Oates.
Oh, yeah, she's like a feminist author. For those of you who haven't heard of her, we love her around these parts. Yeah, yes. Joyce Carol Oates, look her up, y'all.
And the thing that people don't know about Joyce Carol Oates was that she's actually a boxing aficionado because her father used to take her to these boxing matches when she was a kid. So she's very well versed in boxing, and she wrote this really amazing essay about boxing called On Boxing. Mm-hmm. And what I found really important in that essay was how she was talking about in the ring, which is a magic circle, which is a circle that has these boundaries between spectator and the sport, how there is ritualistic tendencies, there's an agreement between who's watching and who's in the ring. But she also just talks about how your opponent is your mirror other, and how when you're essentially fighting your opponent, you're fighting this other version of yourself. And I found that quite important, especially because my work really deals with multiplicity. But
in a consensual way, when you're in that boxing ring, it's not like you're just going and beating on someone. Yeah. Like there's consent is highly practiced in the ring. Yeah,
it's an agreement. Mm-hmm. It's an agreement between you and your opponent, and then your opponent is your mirror self. So whatever moves you make and whatever gains you make and losses, it's really this dialogue between you and yourself in some ways. So I found that really important and really applicable to my work. And also boxing is really interesting and weird. There's there's a lot of regalia that you wear. You come into the ring with these robes.
And the trumpetous soundtrack of victory behind you, yeah.
Yeah, and so there's these hanging heavy bags that become surrogates for the body that you punch, and they swing, and they're hung from the ceiling, and it's kind of macabre, and it reminds us of persecution and sort of like the dark history of witchcraft. But there was a lot of things that I was just quite interested in this idea of even like footwork, and dancing.
I'm going to interrupt for 2 seconds to ask if you remember Milford Kemp, who was the Jimi Hendrix of Montreal. Do you remember that guy? He would be up on the mountain on Sundays with like a little, and he dressed like Jimi Hendrix, like big hat with a feather. And I started talking to him because I love a weirdo. Like I'm like, what's
You're
your
my
story?
people.
Yeah, exactly. I feel comfortable with you. Most people would have just been terrified of him because he was quite a character, but I gave him a tip. He was busking, and he said, "Oh, here's my DVD." I said, "Great." And he was a dancer and a boxer, and I thought of him because of what you just said about, like, he would map out like almost like a choreography in the ring, and then he would draw it.
Oh my gosh.
And so he made these like pieces of visual art that looked like, I don't know, fractal, geometric, but it was like a dance that he had drawn inside the ring. So yeah, boxing and witchcraft, like, we never would have thought of it, but here we are.
Exactly. You never would have thought it, and I didn't either. And it was really like that essay that I read that really introduced. And also, I was in the ring, and I was punching and sweating and considering my footwork and really like conscious of my body in a different way, So that body of work yielded a lot of imagery of individuals or figures that were covered in robes, and those robes were painted with various different patterns and magic hour sunsets and white witch moths, all sorts of things that really like kind of integrated both together. And I made this really big heavy bag that was painted very realistically and then surrounded by gold as though it was some sort of like sacred object.
Which to you it was.
Which it really was, yeah. And it's a body, it's a surrogate of a body. And so going back to this show at Stride, Coven Ring was on the one side, and on the other side was this other show that I had called Invisible Mother. And Invisible Mother also really deals a lot with witchcraft. And really the essence of that show was tapping into this idea of the mother figure and how the mother figure becomes foundations for a lot of thought and a lot of lessons in life, but that through our learning, a lot of women have been persecuted, and through their loss have we really learned and gained. So it was a lot of honoring of that, and that's where they were witch fingers, and those black candle fingers really was a sort of shrine that were lit in honor of, fallen women over time. And you can really take that as you will for, just, women's efforts along history in general. But specifically in my work, in that particular body of work, it was really informed by many things. One of the things was the story of the Hand of Glory. Do you know the Hand of Glory?
I don't.
So,
and I'm going to assume that some of our listeners don't either, so you're going to tell us.
And I had just like discovered the Hand of Glory while I was doing research on the mandrake plant. And so,
I'm sorry, why? Why were you researching that? Because you're an artist and you research random things.
I just research random things. And the mandrake plant, just to tap into what you're saying there, was interesting to me because it is a plant that the bottom half of it, which would be underground, in the ground, the root systems look like a body. They look like a female body for the most part. And then the upper part that's above ground are like the leaves. And the mandrake plant has been used for various things over time. But I was interested in that because there's a particular character in Filipino folklore, which we will get to. And so that really reminded me of the mandrake plant. But back to the Hand of Glory. There was, in my research, I discovered this object called the Hand of Glory. And what it was, apparently there is only one that exists in the world, and it's preserved and in some sort of museum in Britain somewhere. If
Usually,
I can remember
that's where all of the artifacts end up in our Western museums.
Exactly, and apparently this hand is supposed to be the severed hand of a hanged man who was a criminal, because that's why they had hanged him, supposedly, allegedly. And let's see if I get this right. This severed hand then gets pickled in the rendered fat of that man.
Okay.
And then what happens is this hand becomes a magical object where you can light the fingers, and the fingers then so then another criminal supposedly can then hold this hand if you get a hold of this hand, and you can light the fingers. And I think once you do, you can place a hex on people who are asleep in a house. And apparently if you light the fingers and one of them doesn't light, it sort of indicates that somebody else is still awake in the house. And the only way to extinguish this hand is through dousing it with milk, and particularly breast milk. So just really interesting, fascinating things. And then through my research, I found this thing that said, well, the very first hand of glory was supposedly from the severed hand of one of the first witches that was persecuted and hung. So I thought, that was just incredibly fascinating to think that, of course, this very powerful object tool could summon up all this magic, and of course it's going to come from a woman. And so then that really started a big bunch of work of dealing with wax and fats and dripping and transition and magic, and again fragmentation, as we're talking about dismemberment and severing. But yeah, that work was really quite interesting. And so the other thing too, to get back to this whole mandrake business, was that the hand of glory was a main de gloire, which something is like mandragore, and it was like a bastardization of a mandragore mandrake. There was some sort of relationship there. I can't really remember off the top of my head every single detail. I am just an artist that does some research here and there.
Yeah, and again, here at Missing Witches, we are not looking for anybody to be the expert on anything other than their own perspective.
Yeah.
So we're gathering perspectives one at a time.
Amazing.
Yeah. So how heavily ritualized is your process? It sounds like, a lot goes into every piece.
I would say that I do have my own various rituals for my creative process. Everything from how I start my day and putting on my specific uniform, which is usually a boiler suit that's covered in paint and splotches and lots of artistic things.
And it's sort of bits and splotches from all of your works leading up to that point.
Exactly. And right now I'm also wearing a boiler suit, but
if you don't know what a boiler suit is, it's like coveralls. It's like a garage coveralls or like a military, like a full one piece.
Exactly, coveralls. And I have many because I just like to collect because I'm an artist.
Ils sont vraiment confortables aussi.
Oui, exact. So, but this one is my presentable one. So I'm wearing this for you, Amy, but the one in my studio is it's covered and it's crusty and I love it and it's comfortable. And and that kind of thing factors into my ritualistic parts of making my work, all the way down to also listening to very specific things. I listen to a lot of music, a lot of podcasts, a lot of audiobooks while I'm making. But whenever I'm painting or drawing and I have to make decisions, then I turn all the music off and it has to be very quiet. And I have to I have to make really important decisions without any kind of distraction or, that sort of thing. Also, constant snacking. I'm always constantly snacking on chips. And, just little snacks because I just love snacks. And you can also just see this tattoo across my fingers there. Across my knuckles, it says, or what would you call these?
Like
secondary
the middle knuckle?
Yeah, middle knuckles. It says merienda, which is a Tagalog word for, which is my mother tongue, and it says snack. And people see this and they go, "Oh, is that your grandmother's name?" And sometimes I just go, yeah, because I don't really want to.
Snack, y'all.
It basically means snack or to snack. So
I was actually a little bit distracted earlier by this piece. I'm pointing at another hand tattoo that Marigold has. It looks kind of like a honeycomb, but a little more scientific and a little more representational. Do you want to describe it?
Yeah, this is actually a hand poke tattoo that I received from Julie on Instagram. She goes by The People's Ink, and she calls herself a bruja, which is a witch.
We love a bruja.
She's a Filipinx healer, and she specifically tattoos Filipino tribal tattoos that have been influenced by various different tribes in the Philippines, and she tattoos them on POC bodies. So I was honored to have her tattoo my hand, my right hand, which is my dominant hand, and my working hand. And I'd asked her to give me a talisman that honored my ancestors. So we had come up with this image together, and the pattern that looks like honeycomb is actually snakeskin.
We see lots of repeating patterns in nature.
Definitely. So snakeskin, there's centipede legs. These are ferns that are 5-pointed to represent like the family members that I have. And this really back part here is sort of the back end of a boat. It's a boat that you travel into the afterlife. And then there's a little star here, which is the star from my mother's province. Big respect to her is she really comes up with a lot of the designs together with her clients, and it's a really beautiful ritual when you go and get a tattoo from her. So it's a ceremony from beginning to end, where you say prayers and you bring offerings to your ancestors, and then she does the poking technique, and then you sort of do sort of a thank you and gratitude afterwards. And yeah, it's a really beautiful thing, and I highly recommend everyone looking her up because she's...
Can you say the name again?
Yeah, so her Instagram name is, or her Instagram handle is The People's Ink.
The People's Ink, and we'll link you to that in the show notes for sure.
Amazing. So being Filipino is a really big part of my work, and all of the folklore and all of the magic and all of the supernatural that I'm very much interested in is all deeply rooted in my heritage. And so there is, when I started doing my master's degree in Montreal, I was already starting to begin thinking about this idea of fragmentation and multiplicity through my personal experience as being an immigrant, and our immigration as my departure point for my work. And at that time, I was thinking about the things that you take with you and the things that you leave behind when you're moving around. And that could be as big as moving country to country, but it can be city to city, or even neighborhood to neighborhood, or even homes to home, or even room to room, and how you sort of leave traces of you behind. So I was really interested in this idea of like attachment, detachment, and the leaving and the traces. And at the time, I thought, well, as a child, what do I bring with me? Because I don't really have much to bring with me. I'm really young and my experience of life is so small, but I do recall the stories and the narratives that were told to me. So I brought those with me. Those were the things that I brought to Canada. And I have this aunt who I love very much, and her name is Rosalind, and she would be the one to tell me all of the folklore. And, as a kid, I really wasn't interested in, fairy tales and sort of pleasantries. I was really drawn to like the more grotesque and dark parts of the folklore. And specifically, there was this one character called an aswang.
An aswang.
An aswang. Mm-hmm. It's spelled in various ways. It can be A-S-U-A-N-G or A-S-W-A-N-G. And the story of the aswang as a character can really differ from region to region, or from who's telling the story. And so as we know about folklore, that's usually how they mutate and change and evolve over time, which is a beautiful thing about oral traditions. Mm-hmm. So with the aswang, the way that I understood it, a specific one is called a manananggal. That's a little bit harder to spell. But a manananggal translates to separate or to remove. But so this specific one is usually a woman, usually with long black hair, can be somebody in your neighborhood, can be somebody that is a neighbor, looks like a regular human in the day, but at night has the ability to self-sever. So the ability to divide at their waist, and they have to discard their lower half and hide it somewhere in the night, while their upper half flies away and hunts and does some pretty gruesome things like eating viscera and eating babies and these very scary, gross, macabre things. And then at the end of the night, the upper half has to rejoin their lower half, otherwise they die fragmented. So this idea of attachment, detachment was a really important thing for this character's survival. I usually just say she's a hybrid between a witch and a vampire, in that she's sort of this viscera sucker, and she eats the viscera. But she's also a witch because she sort of operates on the outskirts. And so immediately that character started to become and inform everything about my artwork going forward. So even if you look at my works now, and if you look at the works at Coven Ring or anything that I make or draw, the Aswang character is embodied in all of them. So you might see characters that have multiple limbs that might be severed, disjointed. You might see a figure that's covered in like a shroud. All of those versions are all my reconfigured versions of what an Aswang is, to talk about this idea of multiplicity and strength and empowerment through personal experience. And so another thing, too, is if you see the Aswangs, the kind of most newest iteration of it would be the ones that are shrouded, and they have what look like some sort of garment that kind of covers them, that looks like it's blotchy with ink. And basically what that, quote, garment is really a skin. It's not really a fabric, and they're not really hiding behind a fabric. They're actually revealing themselves through the fabric. And the fabric is a skin that's covered in blotches that are meant to represent ink and blood and dirt and rot and the cosmos. And all of those things really speak about experience. And the way that you apply ink is it's very hard to control ink. But you can to an extent, but then you also have to give in to its fluidity. And so every time I make those drawings or paintings or tattoos, they all are very different, and those Aswangs show their experience through their skin. So it's not so much about concealing, it's really about revealing through choice.
So you've sort of taken this iconography of like a monster-ish creature and used it as a symbol of empowerment.
Yeah.
And I think that is like witchcraft at its core.
And I'll tell you another thing too. So there's this really amazing paper that was written by Herminia Quimpo-Mañez, and it's about, I think it's called The Aswang Mythology and the Politics of Gender. I might actually have messed that title up, but it's something like that. Anyway, so it's Herminia Quimpo-Mañez. And in this essay, she argues that the Aswang actually comes after colonization. So the Philippines was colonized for 300 years by the Spanish. And so before they were colonized, they were a people that were quite egalitarian. And they had healers and shamans called babaylan.
Yes, and for those of you who are listening right now, tune in next Sunday for our episode about Urduja, a very famous and wonderful babaylan.
Amazing. So babaylan. And so what they say actually, in what she argues in this paper, is that during the colonization and during the missionizing of the people, they had to take pre-existing belief systems and invert them in order to Catholicize. And so these shamans who were in charge of midwifery and healing and spiritual practices that were all life-giving were then demonized and villainized to become life-taking. And so she argues in her paper that even this idea of severing from your lower half means that you're severing away from your reproductive organs, and you're starting to represent sort of the opposite side of life-giving. And
this colonial fragmentation.
Exactly.
Of these ideas,
yeah, and so she really becomes this malicious, malevolent creature.
And we saw this with Medusa too, right?
Yes, with Medusa.
Who was like for those of you who don't know the backstory behind the head of snakes, Medusa was a rape victim.
Yeah, she was a victim of abuse. And yeah, Medusa is a really powerful figure. Yeah. And I actually do a lot of tattoos of Medusa heads because she's quite important.
And I mean, a lot of us can relate to this, like, oh, you're an angry, insert whatever you are here, an angry woman, an angry this, an angry that, and completely discounting the steps that angered us.
Yeah, exactly. You know? There's a process of that anger. And that anger is an important thing. It's an important protest.
How does witchcraft manifest in, like, your regular day life?
Yeah, I guess, it's really interesting because I haven't really like looked at it through that lens where I go, well, what are the things I do? But, talking to you more and more, I do have a lot of rituals that I do that are quite witchy. And I think it's important to think about witchcraft as something that's very open-ended, you know, and I think that's what's important. And if there's anything that I want to convey is that maybe my witchcraft is the fact that I am very open. I think that, you know, to be open and to allow a porousness to happen between you and your experiences, the people you meet, the way that you see a situation, the way you start your day. I think that's really important. And I think that's maybe the best way to describe what my witchcraft is. But that said, I also do some very specific things every day that I don't know if you can necessarily call this witchcraft, but I just have those. Everybody has their rituals, their morning rituals, their specific way they take their coffee, their specific way. I have to have my red rose first thing in the morning.
You're talking about the tea, not the flower?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
My fiance has to come into the room with a single red rose every morning. No, we're talking about a cup of tea. Don't get so bougie.
Oh, yeah. Just like cup of tea. And it's the most unbougie. I'm the bougie of the bougies. I do love my red rose, and I do love a single egg in the morning. It's this thing where, you know, if anything, when we talk about bodies, it's the thing that I really feel like as soon as I ingest it, I feel awake and I feel conscious of my body. Oftentimes when I do wake up in the morning and before I go to bed, I do just say a thanks to the universe. I do that because I have a lot of things to be grateful for, and I definitely am aware of my privilege. And that's something that I carry with me and I have gratitude for, to make sure that I'm conscious and always conscious of what it is that the gifts that I have, and also, my place and how to share it. Yeah.
I think gratitude is definitely one of the witchiest things out there, just like, because of all the things that we take for granted. Like, that breath that I just took, that air was just sitting there ready and waiting for. We don't thank the air, witches do.
Yeah, it's true. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, air. Thank you, air.
Thank you, air. Yeah. I definitely thank my body a lot for getting me to and from. That is something I do. And also when I was boxing, I don't competitively box anymore, but there was a time that I did. And it was a really time-consuming moment in my life. And it was the kind of thing where I couldn't really have anything else outside of it because it occupied so much of my brain space and so much of my body. And, you know, you had to be very conscious of what you ate and how you exercised and how you spent your free time. And it really didn't leave a ton of space for other things. And so I really gave that my all, and it answered a lot of questions that I had at the time. But those questions are answered now, and I don't really need to go there. Plus, I really am so protective of my head now more than ever.
Like your physical...
My physical head. Because, you know, when I was boxing, it was very violent to my head and, you know, to my body. But the head, and we think about brain trauma a lot these days, and that's something that I'm just so grateful that I didn't really do a lot of damage. But anyway, it was a really powerful moment in my life. I don't think I can recreate it, and I'm so happy to leave it where it is, and what it's done for me. So when I think back, I have a lot of gratitude for the strength that I gained during that time.
And that's another great thing about being a witch, is that you accept that change is good, that the moon has phases, and so do we. You're not like, well, I'm a professional, you know, competitive boxer, and that's what I am now, and I'm gonna die on this hill. Like, you're allowed to stop asking the question when you get the answer. You're allowed to. What's that quote? You're under no obligation to be the same person you were 5 minutes ago.
It's, again, remember, like, my magic and my witchcraft is the power of choice. So you can choose and do whatever you want.
Let's get into that more, because a lot of your early life, you had no choice. So do you think that your focus on this idea of choice is a reaction to that, or?
I mean, that's a really good question. I don't really think that my inability to choose because I was a child really affected me. If anything, I really honored that time, because I honor the fact that my parents made an incredible choice, which was to leave the Philippines and to come to Canada for a life for their kids. So there's three of us. I have an older brother and a younger sister.
The Libra middle child.
Libra middle child, and I love my siblings very much. And so, if anything, I really think back to those moments and think about how powerful that was for them to leave their families behind and come to a country that they didn't know anybody in, and weren't strong in the language. And, you know, it's a completely different landscape, social landscape, geographical landscape, and to make a life for themselves. And so, if anything, I'm able to do and think and feel the way that I can because of them. So it's not even really as much of a rebellion, even though sometimes I do think a lot that there was a lot of pushback. You know, as a kid, I went to church a lot. Like I went to I was raised Christian and Roman Catholic. So obviously I don't go to church anymore, and I haven't. And I feel like that was a very conscious choice, and that was like a choice to really disavow that and be a free thinker. And I think that's really, again, the power is being a free thinker.
Would you say that it's not Catholicism that you rejected so much as dogma in general then?
Yeah, just the dogma. But, you know, I think like this is really funny because it's not exactly the same thing, but sort of. But I think like even like growing up, I was just really skeptical of male figures, to be perfectly honest. I really was. Like I hated, and to this day still do, Santa Claus. Oh my goodness.
Give us your perspective on Santa Claus.
Oh my gosh, who is this old white guy who's supposed to tell us if we were good or bad and then withhold gifts?
Dare you judge me?
How dare you judge me? I remember my mom, she would, you know, put these Christmas gifts out, and then she would sign like, to Goldie, love Santa. And I would glare at her because I would be like, do you think that I'm so dumb as to think that that there's a true Santa? Like, Mom, this is your writing. Come on. I was like 9. But I tread lightly on that because I don't want to ruin that for other people who have kids.
Well, that's the thing. You know, one of my girlfriends has a son who's like 10 now, and so he's, you know, and she's like a very honest and very like atheist person. Not that those two things necessarily always go together, but for her, she's like very direct, very atheistic. But she's like, I'm not going to tell my kid this so he can go to school and like ruin Christmas for
everyone else. Exactly.
I find Santa Claus very problematic too.
Yeah.
Some of our listeners probably know this already, but the idea of a kid thinking that they weren't good enough.
Yeah.
Like that, okay, your mom is like struggling at her minimum wage job and she can't figure out how to get a Christmas present for you. And you're thinking as a little child, well, I was bad.
Yeah.
So Santa didn't bring me anything this year. Like, it's so problematic on so
problematic.
many levels.
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah. But this is like your white male old man authority Christmas authority figure. So that was like your first taste of like, this patriarchy business is not working for me.
So, yeah. And I also just didn't appreciate this, you know, hoopla at the mall where you'd have to line up and sit on his lap. Come on.
Yeah.
Come on. Like, I don't need to say anymore.
Yeah, patriarchy has this weird way of normalizing really, like, really weird stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But also, I hope that for those people who I'm related to, sorry. Sorry. Because they got kids. And I don't want it ruined for them.
Yeah, but maybe like as a society, we could like sort of change that thinking.
I mean, that's what I would like. I mean, for me to have a little voice in that is as much as I can do, you know?
So let's just say, I mean, we're a long way away from Christmas right now, so you'll have plenty of time to prepare. So maybe start laying this groundwork if you have young children. That, like, maybe it's not healthy for like a being to be watching you and judging you. And then if we can extend that into our dogmatic notion of God, then we can get some world changing going on.
There you go.
Right?
There you go.
So you are so multimedia. Can you get into like, I know you said you're a musician, but you've also done like sound art. Basically, you're like dealing with all of the senses.
Yeah.
So get into that, please.
I feel like that just again has to do with my idea of being open. I think just like as an artist, I have my favorites of how to make my images and how to make sensations, but I don't really want to rely on just one, right? And so that's why I've got the tattooing. For me, that really taps into this idea of intimacy with another person, and it's very small, a tattoo, even though the tattoos I give are, you know, proportionally big because they take up space on a body, to me that they're quite small images still.
Because you were talking before, usually your art
Yeah.
is quite large scale,
Yeah.
so a human body doesn't even have enough
Yeah.
skin space for you to
Yeah.
do that kind of large scale, yeah.
Exactly. And it's also really nice because they're I can finish them in one sitting in, a few hours or maybe even a couple sittings. But regardless, they're not like these paintings that take weeks and weeks and weeks to complete. So that for me is pleasurable, and there's joy in that in the various ways of making work, I suppose. Working with sound is something that's been interesting to me because I, learned how to play guitar when I was younger, and singing is something that's part of my family. My dad's a really good singer, and I just really like singing and having a voice. Also, I'm Filipino, so we karaoke all the time. It's sort of just like part of it. So kind of incorporating music, sound, and that sort of texture into my work was really interesting. And recently I have an exhibition opening where I collaborated with a musician, Mahmoud Hussein, and I recorded a poem that I wrote about this burning woman that was made out of gold, and how her ashes kind of go into the air and they settle and they become the dust that we take into as charcoal, and we make markings on our skin. And then I say that in Tagalog, which is my mother tongue, that I don't speak fluently. But then I record myself singing, sort of repeating this poem. And then Mahmoud went and he sort of digitized it, and he's an electronic musician, so he made a composition and a soundscape. And that is going to be like the soundtrack to this film that I recorded of an actual sculpture of a gold woman that I made, that is made out of gold and plaster, and she's laying on a pyre, basically, of stones, and then I set her on fire. And she's on fire, and she smokes, and then parts of her body disintegrate one at a time. So her leg falls off, and then her head rolls down, and then what's left is this golden hand on top of the pyre. And it's really beautiful imagery that I could never have planned.
What was the hand that we were talking about before?
The hand of glory.
The hand of glory.
Yeah.
The sacred hand? No, that's not it. So you're left with this alternate hand of glory.
Yeah, in some ways. It's really quite fascinating. I mean, hands have been a really big part of my visual imagery. So if you kind of go back and you look at all of my work, a lot of it celebrates the hand in so many ways. So there's lots of severed hands, a lot of blackened hands, and a lot of hands that are ornate and decorated. And so hands are quite important to me. So I could not have planned that, and that was an unintentional thing that happened, and it just was the universe.
Don't you just feel like that's like a gift from the gods when you're just like experimenting, and then the experiment is like so much more successful than you could ever. And that, again, that feels to me when I'm in that process of creating, when it really pays off like that.
Yeah.
It's like spell work producing fruit, That's what it feels like to me,
Yeah, and in that situation where, we set this woman on fire, there's just no way to ever know how that's going to go. You're working with flame and smoke and wind.
Yeah,
and
uncontrollable.
So how do you know how that's going to burn off?
You don't. And that's the most exciting part.
Yeah. So hopefully you'll get to see this show, Amy.
You're doing a show here in Montreal, which is opening...
It opens March 23rd, and it runs until April the 20th.
Okay, so you guys will hear this and have plenty of time. Where is it? It's just in case our Montreal listeners actually want to come
it's at
out.
the May, and that's the Montreal Arts Interculturel Museum.
And what neighborhood is that in?
It's on Jean Mance, so I feel like it might be considered Plateau still, or maybe it's on its way to being downtown.
The MAI on the Plateau. Please go and check out this exhibition. And can you tell some of our listeners who are like, maybe I'll go down to this, what can they expect to find?
So that exhibition is called Malaginto, which means golden. And that exhibition features all of my new ceramic works that I've never had. Yeah, ceramics. So it's a lot of like sculpture ceramics, and every single one has been drawn on by me. And then also there's 22 karat gold on each one. So it's sort of this thing where I'm tapping into this idea of gold and alchemy, and also pre-colonial Philippines had a lot of gold in it as well. So Making a little nod to my culture.
Mm-hmm. And that was part of the reason it was such an important place to overtake, was to get all that sweet, sweet gold, right?
Yeah, and I feel like the history of the Philippines is something that I'm sort of mining, if I can say, every day. And there's just so much to learn. And also just like growing up in Canada, you don't hear about it every day. Obviously, I don't. My parents didn't really sit me down and say, here's some history books. Now read about like where you come from. So it's a kind of thing where, and I think everybody does this, they go back and they unravel their histories a little at a time. And that's really what my work is about, and me as well, is that, taking apart things and unpacking things slowly and processing them in between.
And then putting them back together in your own...
Yeah, weaving it together differently and creating my own mythology.
And then you've got another show?
Yeah, in Edmonton at the Art Gallery Alberta, there's an exhibition there called Surface Tether, and it's featuring a lot of my big paintings as well as some photography of tattooing that I've done.
And there's some landscape work in there too,
yeah,
right?
It's actually, so Surface Tether really deals with body as a landscape and landscape as bodies.
Which makes perfect sense in tattooing, that relationship.
Exactly. Yeah, so I have in that exhibition some very big paintings with a aswang sort of decomposing in the land. I have ink drawings of the aswang shrouded figures. There's a lot of just very still, quiet paintings of landscapes, desertscapes almost, with gradient skies. And then photography that was a collaboration with Stacey Watson. And it's a session, a tattoo session that I have with my friend Lou Bear, who I tattooed across their chest one of my desert landscapes. So it's really like an amalgamation of all of the things I talk about and kind of happened in that one session.
And again, we see this a lot in witchcraft, where we take things that might not necessarily make sense in other people's minds to put together, and put them together to manifest new and different things. New possibilities and all kinds of choice.
Yeah, exactly.
So before we completely run out of bandwidth here, help me wrap it up. Like, what is the gospel according to Marigold Santos?
That you are empowered and that you always are.
That you are empowered and that you always are. I'm going to say that one more time. No, you are. You say it one more time for the people in the back row.
That you are empowered and that you always are.
Thank you so much, Marigold.
Thank
You're
you,
an
Amy.
absolute delight. And y'all, if you're in Montreal, if you're in Edmonton, we're going to post links. Go and check out Marigold's art. I mean, you heard us talking about it. Now go experience it. We love you.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. You must be a witch.
Thanks for listening to the Missing Witches podcast. Be sure to come back Sunday, where we hear the story of another Filipinx marvel, warrior witch Babalan Urduja. And hit us up at missingwitches@gmail.com or on social media at missingwitches. And blessed be.